In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, a man with calloused hands and secrets carved into his soul works alone, building hope one timber at a time. Jed Hollis was once known for his quick draw and quicker departure from towns that grew too curious about his past. Now he swings a hammer instead of a gun, laying foundation stones for a schoolhouse that nobody asked for and few believe in. From her boarding house window, Miss Lillian Price watches him work through dawn's first light and evening's last shadow. She came to Cedar Ridge to teach children who barely exist in the town's memory, the orphans everyone pretends not to see. But watching Jed's steady determination awakens something she thought died with her late husband. What happens when two broken souls discover that sometimes the most beautiful things are built from the pieces of what came before? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Cedar Ridge carried the scent of sage and distant snow, a reminder that winter hadn't fully released its grip on the Colorado territory. Jed Hollis rose before dawn, as was his custom, pulling on worn boots that had walked more miles than most men traveled in a lifetime. His small room above Murphy's general store contained little more than a bed, a washstand, and a battered trunk that held everything he owned. But tucked beneath his pillow lay something precious, a worn leather journal filled with careful sketches and measurements, plans for the schoolhouse that consumed his days and haunted his dreams. The lumber yard where he'd arranged to work in exchange for building materials sat at the edge of town, close enough to the construction site that he could begin before the townspeople stirred. He preferred it that way. The fewer questions asked about his business, the better for everyone involved. As he walked the familiar path, his boots crunching on frost-hardened earth, he could already see the skeletal frame of what would become Cedar Ridge's first proper schoolhouse. 3 months ago, the structure had existed only in his mind, and on the pages of his journal. Now, the foundation stones sat solid and true, the frame rising 16 feet at its peak, with windows positioned to catch the morning light. He'd calculated every board foot of lumber, every nail, every angle, with the precision of a man who understood that some things, once built, must stand against whatever storms might come. From her window at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Lillian Price watched the solitary figure make his way to the construction site. She'd been observing this ritual for weeks now, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the man's unwavering dedication to a project that seemed to serve no practical purpose in a town that barely acknowledged the existence of its most vulnerable residents. Or perhaps it was the careful way he moved, as if every gesture had been considered and refined by experience. Lillian had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 weeks ago with a carpetbag full of teaching materials and a heart still tender from grief. The railroad had delivered her to a town that looked nothing like the thriving community described in the Territorial Education Department's letter. Instead of the growing settlement in need of qualified instruction, she'd found a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. The promised schoolhouse existed only as a converted storage room behind the church, equipped with 3 mismatched desks and a single slate board. The teaching certificate from the Boston Female Seminary, carefully preserved in its leather portfolio, seemed absurdly formal in this rough place. Miss Lillian Price, certified to instruct young minds in literature, mathematics, natural philosophy, and moral instruction. The document bore the seal and signature of the seminary's director, a woman who had never ventured west of the Connecticut River. Here in Cedar Ridge, Lillian's credentials impressed no one and meant less than her ability to manage unruly children without losing her composure. The town council, comprised of 5 men who met monthly at the saloon, had grudgingly agreed to pay her $20 a month for teaching duties. What they hadn't mentioned was that only 7 children attended school with any regularity, and most of those came sporadically depending on their family's farming or household needs. The orphans, those children left behind by mining accidents, disease, or simple abandonment, were not officially enrolled. They were expected to earn their keep through odd jobs and charity, not waste time with book learning. It was these forgotten children who drew Lillian's attention and broke her heart daily. She'd counted at least 12 orphans in Cedar Ridge, ranging in age from 6 to 16. They lived in a ramshackle building behind the church that had once served as a storage shed, supervised by elderly Mrs. Garrett, who did her best with limited resources and no assistance from the town. The children wore clothes that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was hard to identify. They moved with the careful wariness of those who had learned early that the world offered few guarantees. Watching Jed work on the schoolhouse, each morning, Lillian found herself wondering about his motivations. No one had commissioned the building. The town council had never discussed the need for improved educational facilities. Yet this man, who spoke to no one and seemed to have no connection to the community, spent his daylight hours creating something beautiful and functional for children who had been dismissed by nearly everyone else. The mystery deepened each day. Jed's craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of careful work that spoke of formal training or years of experience. His lumber cuts were precise, his joints tight and square. He worked with tools that showed wear, but had been maintained with obvious care. Everything about the project suggested a man who took pride in his work and understood the importance of building something meant to last. But it was more than craftsmanship that intrigued Lillian. It was the way Jed moved around the children when they inevitably appeared to watch him work. He never spoke to them directly, but he was careful not to leave dangerous tools where curious hands might reach them. When one of the smaller orphans had approached too close to the sawhorses, Jed had quietly repositioned his work area without making the child feel unwelcome or foolish. The townspeople viewed Jed's project with suspicion that bordered on hostility. Thomas Brennan, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, had been vocal in his opposition to what he called unnecessary complications. The orphans, in his view, were adequately cared for by Mrs. Garrett and the church. Providing them with formal education would only give them ideas above their station and make them less willing to accept honest work. Mayor Holbrook, a man whose political ambitions were constrained by Cedar Ridge's limited importance, worried that an unauthorized school building might complicate the town's relationship with territorial authorities. He'd approached Jed twice, requesting information about permits and funding sources. Both times, Jed had listened politely and continued working without offering any explanations. The women of Cedar Ridge were divided in their opinions. Some, like Mrs. Henderson, admired Jed's apparent generosity while questioning his methods. Others worried that his project would attract unwanted attention from territorial education officials who might impose new requirements or regulations on the existing school. A few, led by banker's wife Mrs. Thornton, suspected that Jed had ulterior motives and was using the schoolhouse construction as a cover for some other activity. Lillian had heard all these conversations during her meals at the boarding house and her shopping trips to Murphy's store. She'd listened to the speculations and criticisms with growing frustration. Here was a man willing to invest his own time and resources in something that would benefit the community's most vulnerable members, and the response was suspicion and complaint. As autumn progressed toward winter, Lillian found herself timing her morning walks to coincide with Jed's arrival at the construction site. She told herself it was simple curiosity, but deeper reflection revealed something more complex. Watching Jed work with such focused determination reminded her of her late husband David, who had possessed the same quiet intensity when engaged in projects he considered meaningful. David had been gone 18 months now, claimed by the lung fever that had swept through Boston's immigrant neighborhoods. Their marriage, while brief, had been built on shared purpose and mutual respect. David had encouraged Lillian's teaching ambitions at a time when many men viewed educated women as a threat to natural order. His death had left her not only grieving, but uncertain about her place in a world that seemed to have little room for a childless widow with strong opinions about education and social justice. Coming west had been an act of faith as much as practicality. The teaching position in Cedar Ridge offered independence and the chance to make a meaningful contribution to a growing community. The reality had proved more challenging than expected, but watching Jed's steadfast progress on the schoolhouse had begun to rekindle something in Lillian that felt like hope. The autumn weather grew increasingly unpredictable, with warm afternoons giving way to bitter nights that left frost on the windows and warned of the harsh winter ahead. Jed worked steadily through these temperature swings, adjusting his schedule but never missing a day. Lillian began to worry about him working alone in conditions that might prove dangerous if an accident occurred. Her concern crystallized one morning when she watched him struggle to position a heavy beam alone, a task that clearly required at least 2 people. The sight of him straining against the weight, determined to complete the work, despite the obvious difficulty, finally drove her to action. She'd spent weeks observing from a distance, but the time had come to offer assistance, regardless of what the town might think about a lady schoolteacher involving herself in construction work. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying. Lillian had been raised to believe that proper ladies waited for appropriate introductions and formal social occasions before engaging with unfamiliar men. But David had taught her that sometimes the most important connections happened when people simply showed up for each other, conventions aside. Standing at her boarding house window that morning, watching Jed prepare for another day of solitary labor, Lillian made a choice that would change everything. She would walk down to the construction site, introduce herself properly, and offer whatever help she could provide. The schoolhouse was meant for children she already cared about deeply. It was time to stop watching from a distance and start participating in creating something beautiful. The first snow came early that year, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, blanketing Cedar Ridge in silence that seemed to muffle even the boldest conversations. Jed stood in the doorway of his nearly completed schoolhouse, watching fat flakes drift through the opening where the door would soon hang. The storm had lasted 2 days, and now in its aftermath he could see the damage winter had already begun to inflict on his careful work. The roof, though structurally sound, had leaked in 2 places where he hadn't yet installed the final layer of shingles. Water stains darkened the fresh-cut pine of the interior walls, and a small puddle had formed near where the teacher's desk would eventually sit. More troubling was the discovery he'd made that morning while assessing the storm damage. A child's worn primer, its pages water-stained and edges torn, tucked beneath a pile of lumber near the back wall. The book was small, bound in faded blue. Cloth that had once been cheerful, but now showed the wear of many small hands. Inside the front cover, written in careful child's script, were the words, "Property of Annie Morse, age 8. Jed knew that name. Annie had been one of the orphans, a bright-eyed girl who died of scarlet fever the previous spring. Someone had left her book here, perhaps as a memorial, or maybe just because it had nowhere else to go. Holding the damaged primer in his weathered hands, Jed felt something shift inside his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the unfinished walls. This small book represented everything he was fighting for, the chance for children like Annie to learn, to grow, to become something more than their circumstances suggested. The water damage to both the building and the book felt like a judgment, a reminder of how quickly hope could be washed away by forces beyond human control. The sound of voices approaching pulled him back to the present moment. Through the doorway, he could see Mayor Holbrook trudging through the snow, accompanied by Thomas Brennan and 2 other men from the town council. Their expressions suggested this wasn't a social visit to admire his progress. Hollis, Brennan called out before they'd even reached the building. "We need to have a conversation." Jed tucked Annie's primer inside his coat and stepped out to meet them, pulling the door closed behind him. The four men arranged themselves in a semicircle, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Brennan took the lead, as Jed had expected he would. "This project of yours has gone on long enough," Brennan said, gesturing toward the schoolhouse with obvious distaste. "Nobody asked you to build this thing, and nobody wants it cluttering up town property." "The land isn't town property," Jed replied quietly. "I checked the records at the territorial office." "Maybe not technically," Mayor Holbrook interjected, "but it sits right on the edge of our community, and what happens here affects all of us. We've had inquiries from the Territorial Education Department. They're asking questions about our school, facilities, and teacher qualifications. This building of yours is attracting attention we don't need." Jed studied the men's faces, reading the mix of frustration and fear in their expressions. They weren't just annoyed by his unauthorized construction project. They were worried about something bigger. "What kind of attention?" he asked. Brennan and Holbrook exchanged glances before Brennan answered. "The territorial authorities are talking about relocating the Orphans to a centralized facility in Denver. They say it would be more efficient, provide better care and supervision. The existence of this schoolhouse complicates that plan." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. The Orphans relocated to Denver meant scattered to various institutions, separated from each other and from the only community they'd ever known. It meant children like little Tommy Fletcher and the Morse twins would disappear into the territorial system, becoming numbers in ledgers rather than individuals with names and dreams. "When?" Jed asked, his voice tight with control. "They're planning to make the decision by spring," Holbrook said. "Having an unauthorized school building here makes it look like we can't manage our own affairs. It gives them ammunition for their argument that Cedar Ridge isn't equipped to handle the orphan situation properly." The irony was bitter. Jed's attempt to create something better for the children had potentially made their situation worse. His schoolhouse, meant to provide them with education and stability, might instead be used as evidence that they needed to be removed from the community entirely. "There's more," Brennan continued, and his tone suggested the worst was yet to come. "We've been doing some checking on you, Hollis. You showed up here with no references, no background anyone can verify. You've got money for lumber and supplies, but no visible means of earning it. People are starting to ask questions about what you're really doing here." Jed felt the familiar tightness in his shoulders, the instinctive reaction to being cornered that had kept him alive through years when survival depended on reading threats correctly. These men didn't know who he really was. Not yet. But their suspicion was growing, and suspicion had a way of uncovering truths that were better left buried. "I'm building a school," he said simply. "For children who aren't your responsibility," Brennan shot back. "Children who are perfectly well cared for by Mrs. Garrett and the charity of this community. Children who don't need fancy book learning to live productive lives." The fourth man, whom Jed recognized as the town's sole attorney, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Hollis, I'm advising you to cease construction immediately. The town council is prepared to seek a territorial injunction if necessary. This project ends now, or it ends badly." After the men left, tramping back through the snow toward town, Jed remained standing beside his schoolhouse. The wind had picked up, driving snow through the gaps in his coat and reminding him that winter was far from finished with them. Inside his chest, competing emotions warred against each other: rage at the men's short-sightedness, fear for the orphan's future, and a deep, familiar sense of being trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He pulled Annie's primer from his coat and looked at it again. The water damage had made some of the pages stick together, but he could still make out portions of the simple lessons. The cat sat on the mat. Tom has a red top. Anne can run fast. Basic sentences designed to teach children that words had Power, that knowledge could be acquired one small step at a time. The sound of footsteps crunching through snow made him look up. Miss Lillian Price was walking toward him, bundled in a dark wool coat and carrying what appeared to be a steaming cup. She moved carefully but purposefully through the snow, and her cheeks were red from the cold air. "I thought you might need this," she said when she reached him, offering the cup. "It's coffee, with a bit of honey. Mrs. Henderson makes it strong. Enough to wake the dead." Jed accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his cold fingers around its warmth. "Thank you, Miss Price, though I suspect you have questions about what you just witnessed." Lillian smiled, and the expression transformed her serious face into something that made Jed's breath catch. "I have many questions, Mr. Hollis, but the most important one is this: what can I do to help?" Her words hung in the cold air between them, an offer that seemed too good to be trusted. Jed had spent years learning that help usually came with hidden costs, that people's generosity rarely extended beyond their self-interest. But looking at Lillian's earnest expression, he found himself wanting to believe that sometimes people offered assistance simply because it was the right thing to do. "The town council wants me to stop building," he said carefully. "I heard. I was coming back from the mercantile when they passed me on the street. They looked like men who'd just won a victory they weren't entirely proud of. They might be right." "To stop me," Jed admitted, the words tasting bitter. "My building this school might be making things worse for the children, not better." Lillian stepped closer, and he could see the determination in her green eyes. "Mr. Hollis, I've been teaching for 8 years. I've worked in schools where children had every advantage money could provide, and I've worked in places where students came to class hungry and cold. The one thing I've learned is that education is never the problem. It's always part of the solution." She paused, studying his face, as if trying to read something written there. "Those men are afraid. They're afraid of change, afraid of responsibility, afraid of anything that might require them to see beyond their own immediate concerns. But fear is a poor foundation for making decisions about children's futures." The wind gusted again, and Lillian pulled her coat tighter around herself. But she didn't retreat or suggest they continue the conversation somewhere warmer. Instead, she stood firm, waiting for his response. "The territorial authorities want to relocate the orphans to Denver," Jed said finally. "The school might give them justification to do it. Or it might give us justification to keep them here," Lillian replied. "A functioning school demonstrates that this community can provide proper education. It shows we're serious about the children's welfare." The word "us" resonated in Jed's mind. When was the last time anyone had included him in their plans, treated his efforts as part of a shared endeavor rather than a solitary obsession? "Miss Price," he said carefully, "if you help me with this project, you'll be going against the expressed wishes of the town council. That could affect your teaching position." Lillian's smile returned, and this time it held a note of mischief. That surprised him. "Mr. Hollis, I came west to teach children who needed teaching. If the town council doesn't understand that the orphans are exactly those children, then perhaps we need to help them see more clearly." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I took the liberty of writing to the Territorial Education Department. I've requested clarification on their policies regarding orphan education and community schools. I expect we'll have a response within a few weeks." Jed stared at her, amazed by her initiative and touched by her willingness to involve herself. In his problematic situation, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said simply. "Those children deserve someone fighting for them, and you shouldn't have to fight alone." As if summoned by her words, a small figure appeared at the edge of the construction site. Tommy Fletcher, the youngest of the orphans at barely 6 years old, trudged through the snow wearing boots that were too large and a coat that had been patched so many times it resembled a quilt. His thin face was red with cold, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. "Mr. Jed," Tommy called out, using the name the children had given him despite his never encouraging such familiarity. "Is the school still going to be for us?" The question cut straight through all of Jed's complicated considerations about town politics and territorial regulations. Here was the reality that mattered. A child who'd never owned a book, never sat at a proper desk, never had a teacher who belonged entirely to him and his friends. A child whose future hung in the balance of adult decisions made by people who'd never known what it felt like to be unwanted. Jed knelt down to Tommy's level, bringing their eyes to the same height. "Yes, Tommy, the school is still going to be. For you and the other children. Even if it keeps snowing? Even if it keeps snowing." Tommy grinned, revealing a gap where he'd recently lost a tooth. "Good. I've been practicing my letters like Miss Lillian showed me. I can write my whole name now, and cat and dog and son." After Tommy had trudged back toward town, Jed and Lillian stood together in the growing dusk. The snow had begun falling again, and lights were beginning to appear in windows throughout. "Cedar Ridge. Spring isn't far away," Lillian said quietly. "No," Jed agreed, "it isn't." But they both understood that spring would bring decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. The school would either be finished and functioning, proving the community's commitment to the orphans' welfare, or it would remain an empty shell that testified to good intentions defeated by practical concerns. The primer in Jed's coat seemed to grow heavier as he contemplated the challenges ahead. Annie Morse would never benefit from the school he was building, but Tommy Fletcher and the others still could. The question was whether a former gunslinger and a widowed schoolteacher could overcome the resistance of an entire town council and the bureaucracy of territorial government. Looking at Lillian's determined expression, illuminated by the last light of the winter day, Jed began to think it might be possible. The morning after the confrontation with the town council, Lillian arrived at the schoolhouse carrying a basket and wearing work clothes that would have scandalized the ladies of her former Boston social circle. She'd traded her usual teaching dress for a practical skirt and blouse with sturdy boots that could handle the muddy construction site. The basket contained painting supplies she'd purchased from Murphy's store, along with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. Jed was already at work, installing the final pieces of window trim with methodical precision. He paused when he saw her approaching, hammer suspended mid-swing, and she could read the surprise in his expression. "I meant what I said yesterday," she announced, setting down her basket and removing her gloves. "If this school is going to open by spring, it needs more than one person working on it. Miss Price, I appreciate the offer, but this isn't appropriate work for a lady." Lillian fixed him with the same stern look she used on students who tried to avoid recitation. "Mr. Hollis, I can read, write, cipher, and manage a classroom full of unruly children. I suspect I can handle a paintbrush." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly and gestured toward the interior walls. "The inside needs 2 coats of whitewash before we can consider it finished, but it's messy work." "I've painted before," she assured him, though in truth, her experience was limited to touching up the parlor walls in her Boston home. How different could it be? She learned quickly that painting rough-hewn lumber was considerably more challenging than refreshing, smooth plaster walls. The wood seemed determined to absorb the whitewash unevenly, leaving streaks and gaps that required multiple applications. Her arm ached within the first hour, and she'd managed to get more paint on her skirt than on the walls. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work. Each section of completed wall transformed the raw construction into something that looked more like a proper schoolroom. She could envision desks arranged in neat rows, a large slate board mounted on the front wall, and shelves lined with books and learning materials. Jed worked outside, hanging the front door and installing the final window. Occasionally, he would check on her progress, offering quiet suggestions about technique or pointing out spots she'd missed. His corrections were gentle, delivered without condescension, and she found herself grateful for his patience with her amateur efforts. During their midday break, sharing sandwiches on an upturned crate that served as their table, Lillian learned more about Jed's background. He spoke carefully, sharing information in measured doses, but she began to piece together fragments of his story. He'd learned carpentry from his father, a German immigrant who'd believed that a man's worth was measured by the quality of his work. The elder Hollis had been a perfectionist who insisted that any job worth doing was worth doing properly, a philosophy that showed in every joint and corner of the schoolhouse. Jed's tools had belonged to his father, well-maintained implements that bore the patina of decades of careful use. He would have approved of this project, Jed said, running his thumb along the worn handle of his father's hammer. He believed that building something permanent was the closest a man could come to leaving a worthy legacy. What happened to him? Lillian asked gently. Killed in a mine collapse when I was 17. That's when Jed's voice trailed off, and she sensed they'd approached the edge of territory he wasn't ready to explore. I'm sorry, she said simply, understanding that some losses cut too deep for casual conversation. They worked in comfortable silence for the rest of the afternoon. Lillian found herself stealing glances at Jed as he worked, noting the careful way he measured twice before making any cut, the unconscious grace with which he handled his tools. There was something almost meditative about his approach to construction, as if the act of building provided him with a peace that conversation couldn't offer. When the shadows began to lengthen toward evening, they assessed their progress. The interior walls were nearly finished, requiring only touch-up work on the areas where the wood had proven particularly stubborn. The door hung true and straight, and all the windows were properly sealed against winter weather. It's beautiful, Lillian said, and meant it. The schoolhouse had the austere elegance of functional design executed with care. Every element served a purpose, but nothing had been done carelessly or without attention to aesthetics. It will be, Jed corrected, when it has desks and books and children filling it with noise. As they cleaned their tools and prepared to leave, a group of orphans appeared at the edge of the construction site. They approached with the careful wariness of children who'd learned not to assume welcome anywhere, but their curiosity was stronger than their caution. Tommy Fletcher led the group, his hand clasped firmly in that of his older sister Mary, a solemn 9-year-old who'd appointed herself his primary protector. Behind them came the Morse twins, Sarah and Samuel, still grieving their sister Annie's death, but drawn by the promise of something new and hopeful. Bringing up the rear was Ben Cartwright, nearly 16 and old enough to understand better than the younger children how precarious their situation really was. "Can we see inside?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lillian looked to Jed, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Of course you can," she said warmly. "This is your school, after all." The children filed through the doorway with an almost religious reverence, their eyes wide as they took in the whitewashed walls and properly fitted windows. Tommy immediately claimed a spot near the front where he announced the teacher's desk should go, while the twins examined the corners where they decided the bookshelf belonged. Ben hung back, his expression more cautious than the younger children's. At 16, he was old enough to have heard the adult conversations about territorial authorities and relocation plans. He was also old enough to recognize that buildings could be torn down as easily as they were erected. "It's real nice, Mr. Jed," Ben said finally, "but what happens if the town council decides they don't want it?" Jed met the boy's eyes with steady honesty. "Then Miss Price and I will have to convince them that they do want it. And if you can't, then we'll find another way." Ben nodded slowly, accepting the uncertainty that was simply part of his life. "Well, it's the finest building any of us ever had made just for us. That counts for something, even if things don't work out." After the children left, chattering excitedly about their plans for the school, Lillian and Jed stood together in the gathering dusk. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky. "They trust you," Lillian observed. They trust you too, Jed replied. Maybe more than they trust me. You're the one who's actually teaching them. It was true. Over the past weeks, Lillian had begun holding informal lessons for the orphans in the storage room behind the church. Nothing elaborate. Basic reading and arithmetic, simple geography and natural science. But the children absorbed the lessons with an eagerness that reminded her why she'd become a teacher in the first place. The Territorial Education Department's response should arrive soon, she said. I've been thinking about what we'll do if they support the relocation plan. Jed waited for her to continue, but she found herself reluctant to voice her half-formed ideas. They seemed both too ambitious and not ambitious enough, grand enough to solve everything, small enough to accomplish nothing. What if we could demonstrate that the children are receiving better education here than they would in Denver? She said finally. What if we could show measurable progress in their learning, evidence that keeping them in Cedar Ridge serves their interests better than moving them? How would we do that? Formal testing, documentation of their advancement, letters of recommendation from established educators. She paused, gathering courage for the more radical suggestion. And what if we could provide them with family situations as well as education? What if some of them could be properly adopted by local families? Jed was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. The people here aren't exactly fighting over the chance to take in extra children. Not yet, Lillian agreed. But people's attitudes can change when they see children as individuals rather than burdens. Tommy's been helping Mrs. Henderson with small chores at the boarding house. She's grown quite fond of him. And the others? Sarah and Samuel are bright and willing workers. Ben's nearly old enough to apprentice to a trade. Mary has a gift for managing younger children. She'd be valuable to any family with little ones. They were talking about reshaping the entire social structure of Cedar Ridge, convincing a community that had always seen the orphans as temporary inconveniences to embrace them as permanent additions. It was an audacious plan that required changing hearts as well as minds. It could work, Jed said slowly, if we had enough time, and if the school proved itself, and if the territorial authorities were willing to listen to reason. A lot of ifs, Lillian acknowledged. Every worthwhile endeavor has a lot of ifs, Jed replied. The question is whether the possible outcome justifies the risk. Looking at the schoolhouse they'd spent the day improving, Lillian felt certain that it did. The building represented more than just a place for lessons. It was a declaration that these children mattered, that their futures were worth investing in, that a community could choose to expand its definition of family beyond blood relationships. Mr. Hollis, she said as they prepared to part ways for the evening, I want you to know that whatever happens with the town council or the territorial authorities, building this school was the right thing to do. Jed studied her face in the starlight, and she saw something shift in his expression, a softening that suggested her words had touched something deeper than mere appreciation. Thank you, Miss Price. That means more than you might realize. As they walked back toward town together, their footsteps echoing in the crisp night air, Lillian found herself thinking about the children's excitement as they'd explored their future classroom. Tomorrow, she would continue her informal lessons, and Jed would continue his construction work, and together they would keep building something that felt increasingly like hope made tangible. The challenges ahead remained formidable, but for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Lillian felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks into their partnership, Lillian and Jed had established a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She arrived each morning with coffee and whatever breakfast Mrs. Henderson could spare, while he brought tools and the quiet determination that seemed to drive him through each day's tasks. The schoolhouse interior was nearly complete now, with fresh whitewash brightening the walls and carefully crafted benches arranged in neat rows. The work had changed them both. Lillian's hands, once soft from years of genteel teaching, now bore the honest calluses of physical labor. She'd learned to handle a paintbrush with confidence, to measure twice before cutting, and to see potential in raw materials. More importantly, She'd discovered a satisfaction in creating something tangible that her years of abstract instruction had never provided. Jed, meanwhile, had begun to speak more freely during their shared meals and quiet moments between tasks. The careful reserve that had initially marked all his interactions remained, but it had softened around the edges. He asked questions about her teaching methods, listened thoughtfully to her plans for organizing the classroom, and gradually revealed glimpses of a mind that was both practical and surprisingly well-educated. "You read a lot," Lillian observed one afternoon as they shared lunch. She'd noticed him studying a book during their morning break, his weathered fingers turning pages with obvious familiarity. "My father insisted on it," Jed replied. "Said a man who couldn't read was at the mercy of those who could. He made sure I learned letters and numbers before I ever touched his tools." "What are you reading now?" Jed hesitated, then pulled the book from his coat pocket. It was a worn copy of Emerson's essays, the binding cracked and pages yellowed with age. "Essays on self-reliance and other topics," he said, slightly defensive. "Probably not what you'd expect from a carpenter." Lillian felt her estimation of him shift yet again. Ralph Waldo Emerson was hardly light reading, and the marginalia she glimpsed suggested Jed had engaged seriously with the philosophical content. "On the contrary, I think Emerson would have approved of your project here. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." A smile tugged at the corner of Jed's mouth. "You know his work. I taught literature before I came west. Emerson was one of my favorite authors to discuss with students. His ideas about individual conscience and moral action seem particularly relevant out here, where social conventions carry less weight." They talked about literature for the remainder of their break, and Lillian found herself delighted by Jed's insights. He read not as a scholar seeking abstract understanding, but as a man looking for practical wisdom about how to live. His interpretations were grounded in experience rather than theory, giving familiar passages new resonance. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. What had begun as a working partnership based on shared concern for the orphans was becoming something more complex, a friendship built on mutual respect and genuine intellectual compatibility. Lillian found herself looking forward to their daily talks almost as much as their collaborative work. The children had become regular visitors to the construction site, arriving after their morning chores to watch the progress and offer eager assistance. Lillian had formalized their education somewhat, bringing slates and primers to the schoolhouse for impromptu lessons during work breaks. The arrangement allowed her to assess their individual needs while giving them a sense of ownership. In their future classroom, Tommy Fletcher showed particular aptitude for reading, sounding out simple words with determination that reminded Lillian of Jed's approach to construction: methodical, persistent, and ultimately successful. Mary Fletcher had a gift for arithmetic, quickly grasping concepts that challenged children twice her age. The Morse twins complemented each other beautifully, with Sarah excelling at memorization, while Samuel demonstrated natural curiosity about the world around him. Ben Cartwright remained somewhat apart from the younger children's enthusiastic participation, but Lillian noticed him listening intently to every lesson. At 16, he was acutely aware of his limited time for formal education. Soon, he would need to find permanent work or apprentice to a trade, choices that would determine the trajectory of his entire adult life. Ben's worried about his future. Lillian confided to Jed one evening as they cleaned their tools. "He's too old for adoption, but too young for complete independence. The territorial system would probably apprentice him to whatever industry needs workers, regardless of his interests or abilities. What does he want to do? He's never said directly, but I think he has mechanical inclinations. I've seen him studying how things work. Watches, harnesses, even the construction techniques you use. He asks intelligent questions about joints and measurements." Jed nodded thoughtfully. "There's a clockmaker in Denver who might take on an apprentice, man named Fisher. does good work and treats his workers fairly. If Ben's interested, I could write a letter of introduction." The casual offer revealed another layer of Jed's mysterious past. How did a drifting carpenter know established craftsmen in Denver well enough to provide character references? Lillian filed the question away with the growing collection of puzzles. Surrounding her partner's background, their evening conversations had become increasingly personal as the weeks passed. Lillian found herself sharing memories of her marriage to David, describing the dreams they'd shared and the future they'd planned before fever claimed him. Speaking about David felt like opening a healing wound, painful but necessary for recovery. "He would have liked this project," she said one evening, gesturing toward the completed schoolhouse. "David believed that education was the most radical act possible in a democracy. He said that every child who learned to read and think critically was a victory against tyranny and ignorance. He sounds like a good man." He was. Too good for this world, perhaps. She paused, surprised by her own willingness to share such intimate thoughts. "I used to think that losing him meant my life was essentially over, that I would spend whatever years remained just going through the motions. Coming here, working on this school, has reminded me that life continues to offer purposes worth pursuing." Jed listened with the focused attention he brought to all serious conversations, his eyes never leaving her face. "I understand something about starting over," he said quietly, "about trying to build something better from the pieces of what came before." There was pain in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Lillian sensed that Jed's need for reinvention went deeper than simple wanderlust or career change. Something in his past had broken fundamentally, requiring not just geographical relocation, but psychological reconstruction. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken questions and half-revealed truths. Lillian felt the urge to press for more details, to understand what had driven this educated, skilled man to a life of apparent isolation. But she also recognized that trust, like their schoolhouse, required careful construction over time. "I should probably head back," Jed said finally, breaking the spell of intimacy that had settled around them. "Mrs. Henderson will worry if you're out much later." They walked toward town in comfortable silence, but Lillian was acutely aware of Jed's presence beside her. Somewhere during their weeks of collaboration, her feelings had shifted from professional respect to something more personal. She found herself noticing details that had nothing to do with carpentry skills. The way late sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the unconscious grace with which he moved, the rare but transformative effect of his infrequent smiles. The realization troubled her. David had been dead less than 2 years, and the conventions of her upbringing suggested that her grief should remain primary for much longer. More practically, Jed remained an enigma whose past contained secrets that might prove dangerous or shameful. Developing romantic feelings for a man whose history was largely unknown seemed both disloyal to David's memory and potentially foolish. But her heart, apparently, cared little for convention or caution. The connection she felt to Jed had grown organically from shared work and common purpose, strengthened by daily collaboration and deepening conversation. Whatever his secrets might be, the man she'd come to know was honorable, gentle with children, and committed to creating something beautiful for people who had given him nothing but suspicion in return. As they reached the boarding house, Lillian turned to face him in the lamplight spilling from the front windows. "Thank you, Jed, for everything. For building the school, for letting me help, for making me feel useful again." He studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might say something that would change everything between them. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both formal and somehow tender. "Thank you, Lillian, for believing this was worth doing, for making it better than I could have managed alone." The use of her given name sent warmth spreading through her chest. It was a small intimacy, but it felt like crossing a threshold they couldn't uncross. Standing there in the lamplight, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the settling town, Lillian felt the future spreading before them like pages in an unwritten book. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the town council's opposition, the territorial authorities' decisions, the practical difficulties of running a school in a frontier community, they would face them together. The schoolhouse they'd built with their own hands would stand as testament to what two people could accomplish when they committed themselves to something larger than their individual needs. But more than that, their partnership had become something neither had expected when they'd first spoken beside the construction site. In building a place where orphaned children could learn and grow, they had also built the foundation for their own transformation. The widow and the mystery man had become Lillian and Jed, two people discovering that the most important construction project was the one they were building together, day by day, conversation by conversation, shared purpose by shared purpose. As Jed disappeared into the darkness beyond the boarding house's circle of light, Lillian pressed her hand against the worn cover of Emerson's essays in her coat pocket. She'd borrowed the book with his permission, planning to reread familiar passages with fresh eyes, but now she found herself thinking about a different quote from the philosopher: "The only way to have a friend is to be one." In the space of a few weeks, she and Jed had become friends. The question that would shape everything ahead was whether friendship might prove to be just the beginning of what they were building together. December arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the schoolhouse windows and reminded everyone that winter was far from finished with Cedar Ridge. The building was essentially complete now, walls painted, windows properly sealed, benches arranged, in careful rows, facing a beautifully crafted teacher's desk. Jed had even installed a small wood stove that would keep the children warm during the coldest months, but completion brought new pressures. The more finished the schoolhouse looked, the more questions it raised among the townspeople. Mayor Holbrook had begun making regular visits to the site, ostensibly to check on building safety, but actually to gather information he could report to territorial authorities. Thomas Brennan had been more direct in his opposition, threatening to organize a petition demanding the structure's removal. Lillian had received the response from the Territorial Education Department, and the news was mixed. Officials praised her initiative in establishing educational programs for orphan children, but expressed concern about unauthorized construction on disputed land. They requested detailed reports on the children's progress and suggested that a territorial inspector might visit Cedar Ridge in the spring to assess the situation personally. The letter had also contained an ominous footnote about efficiency and resource allocation. The territorial government was indeed considering centralizing orphan care in Denver, where professional staff could provide standardized education and supervision. The decision would be made based partly on local communities' demonstrated ability to provide adequate care and instruction. "We have until spring to prove ourselves," Lillian explained to Jed as they reviewed the letter together one evening. "If we can show that the children are thriving here, that they're receiving quality education and finding stable family situations, we might convince them to abandon the relocation plan." Jed nodded, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Something about the prospect of official scrutiny clearly troubled him. How much will they investigate the school's construction? The funding sources, the people involved? "I don't know. Why does that concern you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter in her hands as if it contained a personal threat. "Some questions are better left unasked," he said finally. "Some histories are better left unexamined." It was the closest he'd come to directly acknowledging that his past contained secrets. Lillian felt torn between curiosity and respect for his privacy. Whatever Jed was hiding, it didn't change the man she'd come to know. Someone who worked tirelessly for children who weren't his responsibility, who treated her with unfailing respect, who brought both skill and dedication to everything he attempted. But his obvious anxiety about investigation worried her. If Jed's past contained something truly damaging, it could undermine everything they'd worked to accomplish. The territorial inspector would want to know about everyone involved in the school's establishment. Any irregularities in their backgrounds could be used to justify removing the children. The orphans themselves remained blissfully unaware of the adult complications surrounding their future. They had claimed the schoolhouse as completely as if it had always belonged to them, arriving each morning with eager anticipation for the day's lessons. Lillian had established a formal curriculum now, balancing basic academics with practical skills that would serve them regardless of their eventual placement. Tommy Fletcher continued to excel at reading, working his way through increasingly complex texts with determination that amazed her. Mary Fletcher had become her unofficial assistant, helping younger children with arithmetic problems and demonstrating natural teaching instincts. The Morse twins had discovered a shared passion for geography, spending hours studying maps and asking questions about distant places they hoped to visit someday. Ben Cartwright had responded enthusiastically to Jed's offer of an introduction to the clockmaker in Denver. The prospect of learning a skilled trade had given him new purpose, and he spent his free time studying mechanical principles with an intensity that reminded Lillian of scholarly students she'd taught in Boston. But it was the gradual changes in the children's behavior that provided the strongest evidence for keeping them in Cedar Ridge. They moved with more confidence now, spoke up more readily, and demonstrated the kind of curiosity that came from feeling secure enough to explore the world around them. The transformation was particularly striking in the younger children, who had begun to display the natural playfulness that poverty and uncertainty had previously suppressed. These improvements hadn't gone unnoticed by some members of the community. Mrs. Henderson had commented favorably on Tommy's helpfulness and good manners. Dr. Warren had observed that the children seemed healthier and more energetic than they had in previous years. Even Thomas Brennan's wife had admitted grudgingly that the Morse twins were well behaved when they occasionally ran errands for her household. But positive changes in the children weren't enough to overcome the fundamental resistance to change that characterized many of Cedar Ridge's established residents. The idea of integrating orphans into permanent family situations challenged assumptions about social order that had never been questioned before. People here think in terms of categories, Lillian explained to Jed during one of their evening conversations. There are families, and there are orphans, workers and charity cases, insiders and outsiders. The possibility that someone could move from one category to another makes them uncomfortable. Categories are easier than individuals, Jed agreed. Easier to dismiss a group than to reject a specific child you've gotten to know. His insight was perceptive, and it gave Lillian an idea for their strategy going forward. Instead of arguing abstractly about the value of education or the importance of keeping families together, they needed to help the community see the orphans as individuals with specific talents and needs. She began arranging opportunities for the children to interact with townspeople in positive contexts. Tommy helped Mrs. Henderson with grocery deliveries, charming customers with his careful politeness and obvious pride in doing grown-up work. Mary assisted Dr. Warren during his weekly visits to Mrs. Garrett, demonstrating remarkable competence. In basic medical tasks, the Morse twins organized the church's Sunday school supplies with systematic efficiency that impressed even the most skeptical adults. Ben's situation proved more challenging because of his age and the complexity of finding appropriate apprenticeship opportunities. But Jed had continued corresponding with the clockmaker in Denver, and the responses suggested genuine interest in taking on a student with Ben's mechanical aptitude. The gradual integration strategy was working, but slowly, changing long-held. Attitudes required patience and persistent demonstration that the children could be assets rather than burdens. Some progress was visible. Mrs. Henderson had begun talking about Tommy as if he were a permanent part of her household, and Dr. Warren had mentioned that Mary showed real potential for medical training, but resistance remained strong among the community's leadership. The town council continued to view the schoolhouse as an unauthorized complication, and Thomas Brennan had been vocal in his opinion that providing too much education to orphans would only make them dissatisfied with honest labor. The situation came to a head during a particularly cold evening in mid-December. Lillian was working late at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the following day, when she heard footsteps approaching through the snow. She looked up to see Jed in the doorway, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "There's something you need to know about me before this goes any further." The seriousness in his voice made her stomach tighten with apprehension. She set down her pen and gave him her full attention, preparing herself for whatever revelation had driven him to this moment of honesty. "I haven't been entirely truthful about my background," he began, his hands clenched at his sides. "My real name is Jed Hollis, but that's not the name I was known by for most of my adult life." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "For 15 years, I was a gunfighter. They called me the Phantom because I could outdraw anyone and disappear before the law arrived. I hired my gun to cattle barons, mining companies, anyone willing to pay for problems to be solved with violence." The words hung in the cold air between them, transforming everything Lillian thought she knew about the man she'd grown to care for. The gentle carpenter who built schools for orphans had once been a professional killer. The philosophical reader of Emerson had made his living through violence. "I killed men," Jed continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some who deserved it, some who probably didn't. I told myself I was just doing a job that other people's decisions to hire me made, them responsible for the consequences. But that was cowardice, pure and simple." Lillian stared at him, trying to reconcile this confession with the man who treated children with such tender care, who approached every task with meticulous consideration, who had never shown even a hint of aggression in all their time working together. "What changed?" she asked finally. 5 years ago, I was hired to eliminate a homesteader family that was interfering with a land grab in New Mexico territory. Man named Patterson had a legal claim to water rights that a cattle baron wanted. Simple job, make the family disappear and let the lawyers sort out the ownership afterward. His voice cracked slightly, and Lillian could see the pain etched in, the lines around his eyes. "When I got to the homestead, I found a man, his wife, and 3 children. The youngest was a girl about Tommy's age. She looked at me with such trust, asked if I was there to help fix their broken wagon wheel." Jed paused, struggling with the memory. "I couldn't do it. For the first time in 15 years, I couldn't pull the trigger. I warned them instead, told them to pack up and leave immediately. But the cattle baron's other men were already on their way. By the time the family tried to escape, it was too late. They were killed, all of them, and I was blamed for it. The cattle baron claimed I'd been hired by the homesteaders to eliminate his men, that the family's death was my fault for betraying him. There were witnesses who swore they'd seen me kill the parents and children. A wanted poster went out with my description and a reward that would make any bounty hunter rich." The pieces of Jed's carefully guarded past were falling into place. The careful way he avoided attention, his reluctance to provide background information, his anxiety about official investigations, all of it made sense now. "So you became Jed Hollis the carpenter," Lillian said. "I buried the Phantom and everything he represented. Spent 2 years learning honest trades, trying to become someone who built things instead of destroying them. When I came to Cedar Ridge, I thought I could just be a man with a past that didn't matter anymore." He looked directly at her then, and she could see the fear in his eyes, fear that this revelation would change everything between them, that she would see him differently, that the connection they'd built would crumble under the weight of truth. "Now you know," he said simply, "and now you understand why a territorial investigation could be dangerous for everyone involved. If they dig too deeply into my background, if they discover who I really am, it won't matter how well the children are doing or how successful the school becomes. The association with a wanted fugitive will be enough to justify removing them. Lillian sat in silence, processing everything he'd told her. The revelation was shocking, but somehow it didn't fundamentally alter her perception of the man sitting across from her. The Jed she knew, patient, skilled, dedicated to helping vulnerable children, was real. His past as a gunfighter explained some of his complexity, but didn't negate the goodness she'd witnessed daily. "Are you planning to leave?" she asked. "I should. My presence here puts the entire project at risk. If I disappear before the territorial inspector arrives, you and the children will be safer. And if you stay, then we continue as we have been, hoping that my past remains buried long enough for the school to prove itself. But Lillian, you need to understand the risk you'd be taking. Association with me could destroy your reputation and your career." She stood up, moving to the window that looked out over the town, where lights were beginning to appear in houses where families were gathering for evening meals. In one of those houses, Mrs. Henderson was probably helping Tommy with his reading. In another, Dr. Warren might be telling his wife about Mary's progress as his assistant. "Jed," she said without turning around, "do you regret the life you lived before? Every day. Do you believe you've become a different person?" "I've tried to become one." "Then that's enough for me." She turned to face him, seeing the surprise in his expression. "Whatever you were before, the man I know now is worth trusting. The man I know now would never hurt innocent people. The man I know now has built something beautiful for children who needed someone to believe in them." Relief flooded his features, followed immediately by something that looked like hope. "You're not afraid of me?" "I'm afraid for you," she corrected. "I'm afraid that your past will catch up with you before we finish what we've started. But afraid of you? No, never." The space between them seemed to crackle with emotion as they looked at each other across the schoolroom. Lillian felt her heart beating faster, aware that they had crossed another threshold in their relationship. Knowing Jed's secrets made their partnership both more dangerous and more precious. "We'll face whatever comes together," she said firmly. "The school, the territorial inspection, your past, all of it. Together." Jed's smile, when it came, was like sunrise after a long night. "Together," he agreed. Outside, snow began falling again, blanketing Cedar Ridge in the kind of pristine silence that made everything seem possible. Inside the schoolhouse they'd built with their own hands, two people who had found each other. Against all odds, prepared to fight for a future that neither could achieve alone. The arrival of Marcus Thornfield in Cedar Ridge changed the atmosphere of the entire town like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. He came in a polished black carriage, pulled by matching horses, accompanied by two men who wore their guns with the casual confidence of professionals. The sight of such obvious wealth and power rolling down the main street sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the community. Thornfield himself was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in the kind of expensive clothing that marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way. He took rooms at the town's best hotel and immediately began making inquiries about local business opportunities, land values, and development potential. Within hours of his arrival, everyone in Cedar Ridge knew that a very important man had come to visit. Lillian first learned of Thornfield's presence when Mrs. Henderson mentioned it during breakfast, her voice filled with the kind of awed speculation that accompanied any contact with genuine wealth. "They say he owns mines and railroads," Mrs. Henderson confided as she served Lillian's coffee. "Made his fortune in California, and now he's looking for investment opportunities in Colorado territory. Can you imagine a man like that taking interest in our little town?" The timing of Thornfield's arrival troubled Lillian. Cedar Ridge had never attracted attention from wealthy investors before, and the sudden appearance of such a man, just as their school project was reaching completion, seemed more than coincidental. Her unease deepened when she learned that Thornfield had specifically requested meetings with the town council, and had asked detailed questions about local property ownership. She shared her concerns with Jed when they met at the schoolhouse that afternoon. He listened to her account of Thornfield's arrival with an expression that grew increasingly grim. "Men like that don't visit places like Cedar Ridge for casual investments," Jed said. "They come when they want something specific, and they usually get what they want." What could he possibly want here? We're hardly a thriving commercial center. Jed studied the official-looking documents Thornfield had been carrying, according to Mrs. Henderson's detailed observations. Land, water rights, mineral claims, maybe railroad access. Rich men don't get rich by ignoring opportunities that others have missed. That evening, Thornfield made his first official appearance at a hastily called town council meeting. Lillian attended as the community's only certified teacher, while Jed remained conspicuously absent. The church hall was packed beyond capacity, with residents crowding in to hear what the important visitor had to say about their town's future. Thornfield spoke with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to addressing powerful audiences. His presentation was masterful, part business proposal, part flattery, part subtle threat. He outlined a vision of Cedar Ridge as a significant transportation hub connected by railroad to Denver and the eastern markets. He described mining, operations that could bring prosperity to the entire region, commercial development that would transform their frontier settlement into a proper town. The centerpiece of his proposal was a grand hotel and commercial complex that would serve travelers and business visitors. The location he had selected for this development was prime real estate, with excellent access to water and transportation routes. It would, he explained, require the purchase and clearing of several parcels of land currently used for various purposes. Lillian felt her blood turn cold when Thornfield unrolled a map showing the proposed development site. The schoolhouse sat directly in the center of the area marked for demolition. "Now, I understand there are some unauthorized structures on the property," Thornfield said with the casual dismissal of a man discussing minor obstacles. "A small building that someone has been constructing without proper permits or legal authority. That will need to be removed, of course. But I'm prepared to compensate the builder for his time and materials." Thomas Brennan immediately voiced his support for the proposal, emphasizing the economic benefits and the solution it would provide to their orphan problem. If the children were relocated to Denver, as the territorial authorities suggested, the unauthorized school would become unnecessary anyway. Mayor Holbrook asked careful questions about timelines and financing, but his enthusiasm was obvious. The prospect of transforming Cedar Ridge into a significant commercial center was exactly the kind of opportunity that could advance his political ambitions. Other council members raised practical concerns about property rights and existing businesses, but Thornfield had clearly done his research. He produced legal documents showing that his company had already acquired several key parcels through private negotiations. The remaining properties, including the land where the schoolhouse stood, could be obtained through territorial eminent domain procedures if necessary. "Of course, I prefer to work cooperatively with local communities," Thornfield said smoothly. "Fair compensation for all affected parties, opportunities for local residents to participate in the development as workers and suppliers. This project represents the best possible future for Cedar Ridge." Lillian listened to the discussion with growing alarm. Thornfield's proposal was comprehensive and well-funded, supported by the kind of legal and political resources that frontier communities rarely possessed. If he was determined to acquire the schoolhouse property, she doubted that anyone in Cedar Ridge had the power to stop him. But more troubling than the immediate threat to their school was the calculated way Thornfield had presented his proposal. Everything was framed in terms of progress and prosperity, making opposition seem selfish and short-sighted. He had positioned himself as Cedar Ridge's benefactor, offering wealth and development in exchange for cooperation. When the formal presentation ended, Thornfield mingled with the audience, shaking hands and making individual connections. Lillian watched him work the room with practiced skill, identifying key influences and tailoring his approach to each person's specific interests and concerns. She was preparing to leave when Thornfield approached her directly, his smile warm, and his manner completely charming. "Miss Price, I believe. I've heard wonderful things about your work with the local children. You must be the school teacher everyone speaks so highly of." "I am," she replied carefully. "Excellent. I'm always pleased to meet dedicated educators. I hope you'll consider the opportunities my development project could provide for expanding educational resources in Cedar Ridge. A proper school building with modern facilities, adequate funding for supplies and equipment. Think what you could accomplish with real support." The offer was tempting and clearly calculated to appeal to her professional aspirations. But Lillian had no illusions about Thornfield's motivations. He wasn't interested in improving education. He was interested in removing obstacles to his development plans. "The children here are quite attached to their current school," she said diplomatically. "Of course they are. Children adapt quickly though, don't they? Especially when the alternative offers so many advantages." His smile never wavered, but something in his eyes suggested that her response had been noted and evaluated. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Thornfield, I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." "Certainly. I hope we'll have opportunities to discuss educational matters further. I understand there may be some complications regarding the children's future placement. Perhaps I can be of assistance in resolving those issues." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Thornfield knew about the territorial authorities' relocation plans and was prepared to use that knowledge as leverage. Lillian nodded politely and made her escape, but she could feel his eyes following her as she left the church hall. She found Jed waiting for her in the shadows outside the schoolhouse, his posture tense with controlled energy. "How bad is it?" he asked without preamble. "Worse than we thought. He has detailed plans, legal documentation, and enough money to make it all happen." "The schoolhouse is directly in the path of his proposed development." Jed cursed softly, a sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve. "Did he mention how he learned about the school construction?" "Not directly, but he clearly knows about it. He also knows about the territorial investigation and the orphan relocation plans." "Jed, this man has done extensive research before coming here." They stood together in the darkness, looking at the building they'd worked so hard to create. The schoolhouse looked solid and permanent in the moonlight, but Lillian now understood how fragile their achievement really was. All their careful planning and dedicated work could be swept away by a man with sufficient resources and determination. "There's something else," Jed said quietly. "While you were at the meeting, I did some investigating of my own. Those men who came with Thornfield aren't just bodyguards. One of them has been asking questions about recent arrivals in town, particularly anyone with carpentry skills who might be using an assumed name." Lillian's stomach clenched with fear. "He knows who you are." "Not yet, but he's looking, which means someone told him there might be a reason to look." The implications were staggering. If Thornfield had somehow learned about Jed's past, he could use that information to destroy everything they'd built. Even if the territorial authorities were prepared to accept the school, association with a wanted fugitive would be enough to justify removing the children immediately. "We need to assume the worst," Jed continued, "that he knows about my background and is prepared to use it. That gives him leverage over the town council, the territorial authorities, and us." Lillian felt despair creeping into her thoughts like cold seeping through a poorly sealed window. Everything they'd worked for, the completed schoolhouse, the children's progress, the growing acceptance from some community members, could be lost because of circumstances beyond their control. "What do we do?" she asked. Jed was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. "We fight. We find a way to protect the children and the school, even if it means risking everything else." "How can we fight someone with his resources?" "I don't know yet, but I know this. Running away won't solve anything. If I disappear now, Thornfield will still want this land. The children will still face relocation. You'll still lose everything you've worked for." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the resolve hardening in his expression. "I spent 15 years running from one problem to another, never staying long enough to build anything permanent. I won't run from this." Standing beside the schoolhouse they'd created together, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a town settling into sleep, Lillian felt her own determination crystallizing. Whatever threats Thornfield represented, whatever leverage he thought he possessed, she wouldn't surrender without a fight. "Then we stand together," she said firmly. "All of us. You, me, the children, and anyone in this community who understands what we're really fighting for. It won't be easy. Men like Thornfield don't accept defeat gracefully. Neither do school teachers who've finally found their purpose," Lillian replied. "And neither do reformed gunfighters who've learned to build instead of destroy." The wind picked up, rattling the schoolhouse windows and reminding them that winter was far from over. But inside the building they'd constructed with their own hands, carefully arranged desks waited for children who had finally found a place where they belonged. Whatever battles lay ahead, that achievement was worth defending. Thornfield might have money, legal documents, and political connections, but he underestimated what people would sacrifice to protect something they'd built from love rather than ambition. The real fight for Cedar Ridge's future was just beginning. The confrontation came 3 days later, on a crisp January morning, when the air was so clear that every sound seemed amplified across the frozen landscape. Lillian was conducting reading lessons with the younger children when she heard the commotion. Outside, raised voices, the stamp of horses, and an undertone of excitement that suggested something significant was happening. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see a crowd gathering in the town square. Thomas Brennan stood on the church steps, holding what appeared to be a newspaper and addressing the assembled residents with obvious agitation. Even from a distance, his gestures suggested anger and vindication. Miss Lillian, Tommy Fletcher, tugged at her skirt, his young face creased with worry. "Why is everyone shouting? Are we in trouble?" Before she could answer, the schoolhouse door burst open and Ben Cartwright rushed in, his face flushed from running and his eyes wide with urgency. "Miss Price, you need to come quick. They're saying things about Mr. Jed. Bad things. Mr. Brennan has a newspaper from Denver and there's a picture." Lillian's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The moment she'd been dreading since Jed's confession had finally arrived. "Watch the little ones," she instructed Ben. "Keep them inside no matter what happens." She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked toward the crowd with measured steps, though every instinct screamed at her to run. As she drew closer, she could make out Brennan's words, delivered with the righteous fury of a man who'd been proven right about his suspicions. "Known criminal. A killer who's been living among us under false pretenses. Look at this," he waved. The newspaper above his head like a battle flag, the Denver Herald dated just last week. "Phantom gunslinger, spotted in Colorado territory. Reward increased to $5,000. The crowd's murmur rose to a buzz of excitement and fear. $5,000 was more money than most of Cedar Ridge's residents would see in a lifetime. The prospect of such a reward being within their reach had transformed Jed from a mysterious neighbor into a source of potential wealth. Lillian pushed through the crowd until she could see the newspaper Brennan was displaying. The headline was exactly as he'd described, but it was the accompanying illustration that made her heart stop. The artist's rendering was crude, but unmistakably recognizable. Jed's face stared back at her from the front page, labeled as "The Phantom, wanted for multiple murders." "Where is he?" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Where's this phantom hiding?" "Probably at that illegal schoolhouse he built," Brennan replied. "The same building he used to get close to our children. God knows what his real intentions were." Mayor Holbrook raised his hands for quiet, trying to restore some semblance of order. "Now let's not jump to conclusions. We need to handle this situation properly, through official channels." Official channels? Thomas Brennan's voice cracked with indignation. This man is a wanted murderer who's been deceiving us for months. He's been alone with our children, working on that school project. For all we know, he was planning to use them as hostages, or worse. The crowd's mood was shifting rapidly from excitement to anger. Lillian could see neighbors she'd grown to know well. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Warren, even some parents of her official students, looking at her with expressions that ranged from suspicion to outright hostility. "Miss Price," Mrs. Henderson called, out, her voice carrying across the square. "You've been working with this man every day. Did you know who he really was?" The question hung in the cold air like a challenge. Lillian felt dozens of eyes focused on her, waiting for her response. Whatever she said now would determine not only her own fate, but potentially Jed's safety and the children's future. She thought of Jed as she'd known him, patient with the children, dedicated to creating something beautiful for them, gentle in all his interactions, despite the violent past he carried. The man described in the newspaper's sensationalized account bore no resemblance to the person who'd spent months building a school with his own hands. "I know that the man you're describing and the man I've worked with are not the same person," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I know that whatever Jed Hollis may have done in his past, he spent the last several months creating something wonderful for children who had nothing." "You did know?" Brennan's accusation was triumphant. "You knew he was a criminal, and you said nothing. You put every child in this community at risk to protect a killer." The crowd's murmur grew uglier, and Lillian could see the mood shifting toward something that might become dangerous. Frontier justice was swift and often brutal, particularly when it involved protecting children from perceived threats. Actually, a new voice cut through the commotion, smooth and cultured and completely calm. "I think we need to consider this situation more carefully." Marcus Thornfield stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, moving with the confident grace of a man accustomed to controlling difficult situations. He'd clearly been listening to the entire confrontation, waiting for the optimal moment to insert himself into the drama. "Mr. Thornfield," Mayor Holbrook said with obvious relief, "perhaps you could help us understand the legal implications of this situation." "Certainly. But first, I think we should examine this newspaper more carefully." Thornfield produced a copy of his own, unfolding it with deliberate precision. "You'll notice that while the reward notice is quite prominent, the actual details are rather sparse. Wanted for questioning in connection with multiple murders, not wanted for committing multiple murders." He paused to let this distinction sink in before continuing. "I took the liberty of contacting some associates in Denver who have access to territorial law enforcement records. The situation regarding this phantom character is more complex than it initially appears." Lillian watched Thornfield's performance with growing unease. His intervention seemed helpful on the surface, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was manipulating the situation for his own purposes. "According to my sources," Thornfield continued, "the Phantom was indeed a known gunfighter, but the current warrant stems from a specific incident in New Mexico territory. A family was murdered under circumstances that suggested professional execution, and witnesses claimed to see the Phantom at the scene." "There, you see," Brennan interjected. "He killed a family, children." "Ah, but here's where it becomes interesting," Thornfield said, raising a finger to emphasize his point. "Subsequent investigation revealed inconsistencies in the witness testimonies. Some evidence suggested that the Phantom may have been attempting to warn the family rather than harm them. The case remains officially open because there are serious questions about what actually happened." The crowd's mood shifted again, confusion replacing certainty. The clear moral lines that had seemed so obvious moments before were becoming blurred by competing narratives and incomplete information. "But he's still wanted," Dr. Warren pointed out, "still dangerous, perhaps. Or perhaps he's a man trying to escape a past that may not be entirely of his own making." Thornfield's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "In either case, I don't think mob justice serves anyone's interests here." Lillian found herself in the surreal position of being grateful to Thornfield for defending Jed, even while suspecting that his motives were entirely self-serving. The wealthy developer clearly had his own agenda, but for the moment, his interests aligned with protecting Jed from immediate violence. "What do you suggest we do?" Mayor Holbrook asked. "I suggest we handle this situation like civilized people rather than a lynch mob," Thornfield replied. "The proper authorities should be notified, certainly. But until they arrive to investigate, this man deserves the same presumption of innocence we would want for ourselves." "And in the meantime," Brennan demanded, "we just let a potential killer wander freely through our community?" Thornfield smiled, and Lillian caught a glimpse of calculation behind his reasonable facade. "In the meantime, perhaps it would be appropriate for Mr. Hollis to remain somewhere where he can be properly supervised. I'd be happy to provide secure accommodation at my hotel until territorial authorities can sort this matter out." The offer sounded generous, but Lillian recognized it for what it really was, a way for Thornfield to gain control over Jed, and by extension, leverage over the entire situation. If Jed was in Thornfield's custody, the developer could dictate the terms of any resolution. "That's very generous," Mayor Holbrook said, clearly relieved to have someone else taking responsibility for a complicated situation. "Not generous at all," Thornfield replied, "simply practical. This situation affects my development plans as, well, you understand. I want to see it resolved properly and peacefully." As the crowd began to disperse, people talking in excited clusters about the morning's revelations, Lillian felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Mrs. Henderson beside her, the older woman's face creased with concern. "My dear, I hope you understand that we have to think of the children's safety first," Mrs. Henderson said. "I'm sure you believed you were doing the right thing, but keeping such a secret, I kept nothing secret that I believed would endanger anyone," Lillian replied firmly. "The man I know has shown nothing but kindness and dedication to those children. Perhaps, but you must see how this looks. A wanted criminal building a school, working closely with orphans who have no one to protect them. People will have questions about your judgment." The implications were clear. Lillian's position in the community, already precarious as an outsider and an unmarried woman, had been severely compromised by her association with Jed. The school project that had begun to earn grudging acceptance was now tainted by scandals. She walked back toward the schoolhouse. Lillian's mind raced through possible responses to the crisis. Jed would need to be warned about Thornfield's generous offer of protection, though she suspected he would see through the facade as clearly as she had. The children would need reassurance that their school and their safety weren't in jeopardy, and somehow she would need to find a way to salvage their project from the wreckage of public revelation. The newspaper in her hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The crude illustration of Jed's face stared up at her, labeled with crimes that might or might not reflect the truth of what had happened years ago in New Mexico territory. But regardless of the accuracy of the charges, the damage to their cause was already done. The man who had built a school with his own hands was now seen as a potential threat to the very children he'd been trying to help. The teacher who had believed in his redemption was now suspected of poor judgment at best, complicity at worst. And the project that had represented hope and transformation for a dozen orphaned children had become evidence of deception and danger. Yet, as Lillian approached the schoolhouse, she could see small faces pressed against the windows. Children waiting anxiously for reassurance that their world wasn't about to collapse around them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever accusations and investigations might follow, those faces reminded her of what truly mattered. The newspaper had revealed Jed's past, but it couldn't change what she'd witnessed over months of working beside him. The man who had patiently taught Tommy Fletcher to hold a hammer properly, who had crafted each desk with care for the child who would use it, who had never once shown anything but gentleness toward the vulnerable, that man was real too. Tibidas. Question now was whether the truth of who Jed had become could overcome the weight of who he had been, and whether a community that had always been suspicious of outsiders could find the wisdom to judge a man by his actions rather than his reputation. The confrontation Lillian had been dreading came that very evening. She found Jed in the schoolhouse after dark, sitting at the teacher's desk with his head in his hands. On the desk before him lay a worn silver locket that she'd never seen before, its chain catching the lamplight like captured tears. "They know," she said simply, entering and closing the door behind her. Jed looked up, and she could see that the weight of exposure had settled on him like physical exhaustion. "I heard. The whole town's buzzing with talk of rewards and bounty. Hunters. Thornfield's offered me protection at his hotel. You can't accept that offer. It's a trap." "I know." He picked up the locket, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "But running isn't an option either, not anymore." Lillian moved closer, drawn by something in his voice that spoke of final decisions being made. "What's in the locket?" Jed opened it carefully, revealing a faded photograph of a family, a man, woman, and 3 children, arranged in the formal pose typical of frontier photography. The youngest child was a girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile. "The Patterson family," Jed said quietly. "The people I was hired to kill. The people I tried to save. The people who died because of my failure." The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. This wasn't just guilt over a failed mission, it was the crushing responsibility of lives lost despite his attempt at redemption. "I kept this as a reminder," he continued, "of what happens when good intentions aren't enough, of why I can never go back to being the man I was." Lillian studied the photograph, seeing in those innocent faces the same trust and vulnerability that characterized the orphans they'd been trying to protect. The connection wasn't lost on her. Jed's dedication to the school project was driven by more than simple charity. It was an attempt to balance the scales, to save children in honor of the ones he'd failed to protect. "Tell me what really happened," she said. Jed was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the locket. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession that had been years in the making. "Marcus Thornfield hired me to eliminate the Patterson family." The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. She sank into one of the student desks, her mind reeling with the implications. "Thornfield? Our Thornfield? The same man who's now offering me protection. The same man who wants to develop this land." Jed's laugh was bitter. He owned mineral rights that the Pattersons' water claim interfered with. Simple business problem requiring a permanent solution. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Thornfield's sudden appearance in Cedar Ridge, his detailed knowledge of local affairs, his specific interest in the school property, none of it was coincidental. "He followed you here," Lillian said. "Not followed, planned. Thornfield's the kind of man who never leaves loose ends untied. When I didn't complete the job and disappeared, I became a liability. He's been tracking me ever since, waiting for the right moment to eliminate that liability permanently." The newspaper article, planted. Notice how convenient the timing was, just as our school project was gaining acceptance, just as the territorial authorities were considering letting the children stay. Jed closed the locket with a soft click. "Thornfield doesn't just want me dead, he wants me discredited first. If I die as a hero protecting children, I become a martyr. If I die as a suspected child killer, I become a cautionary tale." The sophistication of the plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. Thornfield had engineered Jed's exposure at precisely the moment when it would cause maximum damage to everything they'd built together. "What about the witnesses who claimed to see you kill the family?" "Paid to lie. Thornfield had the family killed by his other men while I was riding away from the homestead. The witnesses saw what they were paid to see. Then you can prove your innocence." Jed shook his head slowly. "Those witnesses are probably dead by now. Thornfield doesn't take chances with people who could expose him, and even if I could prove what really happened, it wouldn't matter. I was still a hired killer for 15 years. I still have blood on my hands. The sound of footsteps outside made them both freeze. Heavy boots crunched through the snow, approaching the schoolhouse with purposeful intent. Jed immediately moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. 3 men, he reported quietly. Thornfield's guns! They're surrounding the building. Lillian felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. What do they want? To take me into protective custody, I imagine. Thornfield's tired of waiting for the perfect moment. He's decided to force the issue. A voice called out from the darkness, cultured and reasonable and completely without warmth. Mr. Hollis, I know you're in there. Please come out so we can discuss this situation like civilized men. Jed checked his gun belt, then seemed to think better of it. He unbuckled the worn leather holster and set it carefully on the teacher's desk, beside the locket containing the Patterson family's photograph. What are you doing? Lillian whispered. Making a choice. The Phantom would have fought his way out of this, probably getting innocent people killed in the process. Jed Hollis is going to find a different way. You can't just surrender to him. He'll kill you, maybe. But if I fight, people might get hurt. Children might get hurt. I won't have that on my conscience, too. The voice outside called again, with slightly less patience. Mr. Hollis, I'm afraid I must insist. My associates are growing impatient, and I'd hate for this situation to become unnecessarily complicated. Jed moved toward the door, but Lillian blocked his path. There has to be another way. We can contact the territorial authorities, tell them what really happened. With what proof? Thornfield's had years to cover his tracks. It's his word against mine, and he's a respected businessman while I'm a wanted fugitive. Then we run. Tonight, we take the children and disappear. Where? How? These children deserve better than a life on the run. They deserve the stability and education we've been trying to give them. The futility of their situation pressed down on Lillian like a physical weight. Everything they'd worked for, the completed schoolhouse, the children's progress, the growing acceptance from some community members, was being destroyed by forces beyond their control. I won't let you sacrifice yourself, she said firmly. Not when you finally found a way to live with your past. Jed's expression softened, and he reached out to touch her face with gentle fingers. Lillian, meeting you, working with you, building something beautiful together, it's been the best part of my life. Don't let Thornfield take that away from you, Mr. Hollis. The voice outside had lost all pretense of patience. I'm counting to 10, and then my associates will come in and collect you. I'd prefer to avoid property damage, but I'm prepared to accept it if necessary. The threat was clear. If Jed didn't surrender voluntarily, Thornfield's men would take him by force, probably destroying the schoolhouse in the process. The building that represented hope and transformation for a dozen orphaned children would become another casualty of old violence. 1, 2, 3. Jed kissed Lillian's forehead softly, a gesture that felt like both blessing and farewell. Take care of the children. Help them understand that the school was built from love, not deception. 4, 5, 6. Promise. Me something, Lillian said urgently. Promise me you won't go quietly. Make them work for it. Make them show the town exactly what kind of men they really are. 7, 8. Jed smiled, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been in a different life. Someone capable of happiness. Someone worthy of the love she'd discovered she felt for him. 9. He opened the schoolhouse door and stepped into the circle of lamplight spilling across the snow. 3 armed men immediately converged on him, their weapons drawn but not quite aimed. Thornfield himself remained in the shadows, directing the proceedings with the detached interest of a man watching a chess game. Mr. Hollis, Thornfield said pleasantly, how good of you to be reasonable. My associates will escort you to more comfortable accommodations where we can discuss your situation properly. Before we go, Jed said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, I have something that might interest you. He reached into his coat pocket, and the three gunmen tensed, visibly, but instead of a weapon, Jed produced a folded document that he held up so Thornfield could see it clearly. "A confession," Jed announced. "Everything that happened in New Mexico territory, names, dates, details, including the identity of the man who hired me to kill the Patterson family." Thornfield's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath his civilized facade. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't, but the territorial authorities might be very interested in this document, especially since I've already mailed copies to several newspapers and law enforcement agencies." It was a bluff. Lillian could tell from the slight tension in Jed's shoulders, but it was brilliantly played. Thornfield couldn't be certain that Jed was lying, and the possibility of exposure clearly troubled him. "Even if such a document existed," Thornfield said carefully, "the word of a wanted fugitive carries little weight against that of a respected businessman." "True, but it might be enough to start an investigation, and investigations have a way of uncovering uncomfortable truths." The standoff stretched between them, three armed men and their employer facing a single unarmed man who had just revealed that he still possessed the capacity for strategic thinking. The Phantom might have chosen violence, but Jed Hollis had chosen a different kind of warfare. "In any case," Jed continued, "I'm sure the children watching from their windows will be fascinated to see how you handle a man who's agreed to come peacefully." For the first time, Lillian noticed the small faces pressed against windows throughout the town. The orphans had gathered at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house, watching the drama unfold at their beloved schoolhouse. Other families had also come to their windows, drawn by the commotion and the obvious tension. Thornfield had intended to handle this quietly, but Jed had forced the confrontation into public view. Whatever happened next would be witnessed by the entire community, including the children whose welfare had supposedly motivated everyone's concern. "Come along, Mr. Hollis," Thornfield said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We have much to discuss." As the group moved away from the schoolhouse toward town, Lillian remained in the doorway, watching the man she'd grown to love disappear into an uncertain fate. The silver locket lay open on the teacher's desk behind her, the Patterson family's faces staring up at the ceiling with expressions of innocent trust. The final confrontation was coming, and she was no longer just a witness to the drama. Whatever happened in the hours ahead would determine not only Jed's fate, but the future of every orphaned child in Cedar Ridge. The schoolhouse they'd built together stood as testament to what was possible when people chose construction over destruction, hope over despair. But buildings, however carefully crafted, were only as strong as the community that chose to protect them. And that community was about to discover what it truly valued when forced to choose between safety and justice, between the comfortable status quo and the difficult work of redemption. Dawn came grey and bitter, with clouds that promised more snow before the day was through. Lillian had spent the night pacing her boarding house room, alternating between desperate plans for rescue and darker thoughts about what Thornfield might be doing to Jed in the supposed safety of the hotel. The town felt different in the pale morning light, charged with tension and whispering conversations that stopped whenever she drew near. Mrs. Henderson had been kind, but distant at breakfast, serving coffee and biscuits with the careful politeness reserved for guests who had overstayed their welcome. The other residents avoided eye contact entirely, as if association with Lillian might somehow taint them by connection to the scandal. "The children have been asking for you," Mrs. Henderson mentioned as she cleared away the barely touched meal. "Mrs. Garrett sent word that they're unsettled by yesterday's events." Lillian nodded, grateful for something productive to focus on. "I'll go to them immediately. Perhaps it would be better if you kept the visit brief. People are concerned about your judgment regarding certain individuals. They worry about what influence you might have on impressionable minds." The polite suggestion felt like a slap, but Lillian kept her expression neutral. She had expected This kind of reaction, guilt by association, was a powerful force in small communities. Her relationship with Jed had made her suspect in the eyes of people who now questioned everything they thought they knew about both of them. She walked through the quiet streets toward Mrs. Garrett's boarding house, noting how conversations ceased and curtains twitched as she passed. The careful acceptance she'd begun to earn in Cedar Ridge had evaporated overnight, replaced by suspicion and judgment. It was a painful reminder of how quickly outsiders could become outcasts when circumstances shifted. The orphans were waiting for her in the small common room, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, fear, and stubborn loyalty. Tommy Fletcher immediately ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her waist with desperate intensity. "Miss Lillian," they said bad. "Things about Mr. Jed," he said, his voice muffled against her skirt. "They said he hurt people, but he wouldn't hurt anybody, would he?" The question broke her heart with its simple faith. These children had so little experience with adults who could be trusted that Jed's kindness had seemed miraculous to them. The possibility that he might be dangerous threatened their fragile sense of security. "Mr. Jed would never hurt any of you," she said firmly, gathering the children around her. "Whatever he may have done in his past, I know that he cares about each of you very much." "But he's in jail now," Mary Fletcher said, her 9-year-old face serious with premature wisdom. "Mr. Brennan said they locked him up because he's dangerous." "He's not in jail," Lillian corrected. "He's staying at the hotel while the grown-ups try to understand what really happened." It was a careful euphemism, but Ben Cartwright was old enough to see through diplomatic language. "They're going to send him away, aren't they? And then they'll close our school and send us to Denver." The stark assessment hung in the air like a death sentence. Ben understood better than the younger children how precarious their situation had always been. Jed's exposure as a wanted man had provided the perfect excuse for those who had never wanted the school to succeed. "I don't know what's going to happen," Lillian admitted, "but I want you to remember something important. That schoolhouse was built because people believed you deserved a chance to learn and grow. That hasn't changed, no matter what anyone says about Mr. Jed. Will you keep teaching us?" Sarah Morse asked in her quiet voice. "Even if they make Mr. Jed go away?" Lillian looked around the circle of young faces, seeing hope and fear warring in their expressions. These children had been abandoned by circumstances beyond their control, shuffled between temporary arrangements, treated as burdens rather than blessings. The school had represented their first taste of stability and belonging. "I will keep teaching you as long as I'm able," she promised. "Whatever happens, you must remember that education belongs to you now. No one can take away what you've already learned." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Lillian could see people gathering in the street, their attention focused on something happening near the hotel. The crowd was growing rapidly, with residents streaming from their homes and businesses to witness whatever drama was unfolding. "Stay here with Mrs. Garrett," Lillian instructed the children. "I'll find out what's happening and come back to tell you." She hurried toward the crowd, her heart hammering with dread about what she might discover. The worst scenarios played through her mind: Jed attempting escape, violence erupting, the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. But what she found was something entirely different and far more ominous. Thornfield stood on the hotel's front porch, addressing the assembled crowd with the practiced ease of a political candidate. Beside him, 2 of his hired guns flanked a man in shackles who kept his head down and his face turned away from the crowd. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge," Thornfield was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "I want to thank you for your patience as we've worked to resolve this unfortunate situation. As you can see, the wanted criminal known as the Phantom has been taken into custody." The man in shackles looked up then, and Lillian felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It wasn't Jed. The prisoner was roughly the same height and build with similar dark hair, but his face was that of a stranger, a Hard-featured man who moved with the wary caution of someone accustomed to violence. This morning, acting on information provided by concerned citizens, my associates were able to apprehend this dangerous fugitive. He will be transported to Denver immediately to face justice for his crimes. Applause rippled through the crowd, mixed with expressions of relief and self-congratulation. The people of Cedar Ridge were being presented with a convenient resolution to their crisis. The dangerous criminal removed, the threat eliminated, their community restored to safety. But Lillian understood what she was witnessing. Thornfield had produced a substitute, some unfortunate man who resembled Jed enough to serve as a body double. The real Jed was nowhere to be seen, which meant he was either dead or being held somewhere else entirely. Mr. Thornfield, Mayor Holbrook, called out, "What about the unauthorized school building? Will this resolve the complications with the territorial authorities?" Thornfield's smile was the picture of benevolent concern. "An excellent question, Mayor. Given that the school was constructed by a wanted criminal, I'm afraid it represents a potential safety hazard. My engineers have examined the structure and found several serious defects that could endanger anyone who might use the building." The lie was delivered with such smooth confidence that Lillian could see people nodding in agreement. The schoolhouse that Jed had crafted with meticulous care was being dismissed as dangerous construction, providing justification for its removal. Therefore, Thornfield continued, "I'm prepared to have the building demolished at my own expense, clearing the way for the beneficial development we discussed previously. The children, of course, will be much better served by the territorial authorities' centralized facilities in Denver." Everything was falling into place exactly as Thornfield had planned. The school would be destroyed, the children relocated, and any evidence of what had really happened would disappear along with the building. Jed would vanish permanently, probably buried in an unmarked grave, while his substitute faced justice for crimes he'd never committed. The crowd was beginning to disperse, satisfied that their crisis had been resolved by the wealthy benefactor who promised prosperity and progress. Most seemed relieved to avoid the complications that would have come with actually investigating the truth about Jed's past, or examining their own consciences about the orphan's fate. But as Lillian watched Thornfield's performance, she noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. Near the back of the crowd, partially hidden by the press of bodies, she glimpsed a familiar figure. Ben Cartwright stood with several other older orphans, their faces grim, with understanding that the adults around them seemed to lack. The children knew this was wrong. They had seen Jed's careful craftsmanship firsthand, had watched him work, with patience and skill, to create something beautiful for them. They understood that the man in shackles wasn't the person who had built their school. As the crowd continued to thin, Lillian caught Ben's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the alley behind the general store. He gathered the other children with subtle gestures, and they began moving away from the square with the practiced invisibility of young people accustomed to being overlooked by adults. Lillian made her own way to the alley, taking a circuitous route to avoid drawing attention. When she arrived, she found Ben waiting with Mary Fletcher, the Morse twins, and two older orphans she recognized from her informal lessons. "That wasn't Mr. Jed," Ben said without preamble. "That man was bigger, and he moved different. Mr. Jed never slouched like that." "I know," Lillian replied. "Which means Mr. Jed is still somewhere else, probably in danger. What do we do?" Mary asked, her young face set with determination that reminded Lillian of Jed's own stubborn resolve. The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and peril. These children had more courage than most of the adults in Cedar Ridge, but they were still vulnerable and dependent on the very system that was failing them. "We find him," Lillian said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "And we prove what really happened, but it will be dangerous, and if we're caught, the consequences will be severe." Ben stepped forward, speaking for the group. "Miss Lillian, They're going to tear down our school and send us away, no matter what we do. At least this way, we're fighting for something instead of just giving up." Looking at their determined faces, young people who had already endured more than most adults could imagine, Lillian felt her own resolve crystallizing. Thornfield had underestimated the power of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Then we fight," she said quietly. "All of us, together. But we do it smart, and we do it careful, and we don't take unnecessary risks." The alliance was formed in that moment. A schoolteacher whose reputation was already destroyed, and a handful of orphans whose futures hung in the balance. Against them stood a wealthy man with unlimited resources, hired guns, and the complicity of a community that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But they had something Thornfield couldn't buy or intimidate. They knew Jed Hollis as he really was, not as the phantom he had been. And they understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by the powerful, but by those who simply refused to surrender what they loved. The plan they devised was born of desperation and the kind of reckless courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. While Thornfield's men focused on maintaining the charade in the town square, Lillian and the older orphans would search. For Jed, the younger children would serve as lookouts, their natural invisibility in adult spaces, making them perfect for gathering information without arousing suspicion. Ben had noticed something the adults had missed: fresh wheel tracks leading from the hotel's rear entrance toward the old mining claim on the ridge above town. The tracks were too heavy for a simple carriage, suggesting a wagon loaded with cargo or a prisoner. "There's an abandoned mine office up there," Ben explained as they huddled in the alley. "Been empty for 2 years since the claim played out. If someone wanted to hide something, or someone, it would be perfect." Lillian felt sick thinking about Jed trapped in some dark, cold building while Thornfield paraded his substitute through town. But the mining claim was at least 2 miles from Cedar Ridge, across rough terrain that would be treacherous in winter conditions. "I'll go," she said. "You children need to stay here where it's safe." "No, ma'am," Ben replied with quiet firmness. "We know those trails better than any adult in town. We've been exploring up there for years. Besides, if Mr. Thornfield's men are guarding him, you'll need help." The wisdom of his argument was undeniable, even as every maternal instinct screamed against involving children in something so dangerous. But these weren't ordinary children. They were survivors who had learned to navigate hostile environments. "Through wit and cooperation, Mary and I will create a distraction in town," Sarah Morse volunteered. "Something to keep people focused on the square while you're gone." "What kind of distraction?" Lillian asked warily. "The kind that gets adults arguing with each other instead of paying attention to what children are doing," Mary Fletcher said with a knowing smile. Within an hour, their improvised plan was in motion. Sarah and Mary had positioned themselves near the hotel, asking loud, persistent questions about when the bad man would be taken away and whether their school was really dangerous. Their innocent inquiries quickly drew other children, and soon a crowd of young voices was demanding answers from adults who found it increasingly difficult to maintain their comfortable certainties. Meanwhile, Lillian and Ben made their way up the winding trail toward the abandoned mining claim. The snow was deeper here, and the wind cut through their clothes with bitter intensity. But Ben moved with the confident familiarity of someone who had traveled this path many times, leading them through shortcuts that avoided the most exposed sections. As they climbed higher, the town spread out below them like a miniature village, smoke rising from chimneys and people moving through the streets in patterns that seemed almost choreographed from this distance. It was hard to believe that their entire world was contained in that small collection of buildings, that the fate of a dozen orphaned children could be decided by the actions of a few dozen adults. The mining claim occupied a natural shelf in the mountainside, sheltered from the worst of the wind, but commanding a clear view of the approaches. The main office building was larger than Lillian had expected, a solid log structure that had been built to withstand harsh winters and the occasional assault by claim jumpers. "There," Ben whispered, pointing toward the building. "Smoke from the chimney. Someone's definitely inside." They crept closer, using the scattered mining equipment and outbuildings for cover. The wheel tracks Ben had noticed were clearly visible in the snow, leading directly to the office door. More telling was the presence of 2 saddled horses tied behind the building. Thornfield's men were indeed here. Through a gap in the boarded windows, they could see lamplight and moving shadows. At least 2 men were inside, possibly more. The sound of voices carried faintly on the wind, but the words were indistinct. "How do we get him out?" Ben asked. Lillian studied the building, noting its solid construction and limited access points. A direct assault was out of the question. Even if they could overcome armed guards, the noise would alert Thornfield's other men in town. They needed something more subtle. "Fire," she said suddenly. "Not to burn the building, but to create smoke. Force them to come outside where we can see what we're dealing with." Ben's eyes lit up with understanding. "The old sluice box behind the office. It's full of dry wood and mining debris. If we set it burning, the smoke would blow right toward the building." It was a dangerous gamble, but their options were limited. They made their way carefully around the mining claim, using the scattered equipment for cover. The abandoned sluice box was exactly where Ben had described it. A wooden trough filled with debris that would burn readily once ignited. Lillian used matches from her coat pocket to kindle a small fire among the driest pieces of wood. The flames caught quickly, and within minutes, smoke was billowing toward the office building. The wind carried the acrid smell and grey clouds directly past the boarded windows. The reaction was immediate. Angry voices erupted from inside the building, followed by the sound of the door slamming open. 2 men emerged, coughing and cursing as they tried to determine the source of the smoke. "Damn wind must have caught some. Embers from the fireplace," one of them said. "Better put it out before it spreads." While the guards investigated the burning debris, Lillian and Ben circled around to the building's rear. A small window had been left unboarded, probably for ventilation. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it offered their only chance of reaching Jed without confronting the guards directly. "I'll go in," Ben whispered. "I'm smaller and quieter." "Absolutely not. If something goes wrong, you'll be out here to get help. Besides, Mr. Jed's probably tied up. You couldn't lift him through that window even if you got inside." The logic was sound, even as it terrified her to send a 16-year-old boy into such danger. But Ben was already moving toward the window, testing its frame to see if it would open. The window yielded to careful pressure, swinging inward on hinges that had been recently oiled. Ben squeezed through the opening with the fluid grace of youth, disappearing into the dark interior of the building. Lillian waited in an agony of suspense, listening to the guards still arguing about the source of the smoke. Minutes passed, like hours, before Ben's face appeared at the window again. "He's here," Ben whispered urgently. "Tied up and unconscious, but breathing. There's a back room where they're keeping him. Can you get him out?" "Not alone. He's hurt. Looks like they hit him pretty hard. We need another way." The sound of the guards returning to the building forced them to postpone any rescue attempt. Lillian and Ben retreated to a safe distance, watching as the men resumed their posts inside the office. They had confirmed Jed's location and condition, but actually freeing him would require more resources than the 2 of them possessed. "We need help," Lillian said finally. "Real help from adults who understand what's at stake. Who would believe us? And even if they did, who would be willing to go against Mr. Thornfield?" It was a valid question. Most of Cedar Ridge's residents had already chosen sides, either supporting Thornfield's development plans or remaining neutral to avoid conflict. The few who might sympathize with their cause lacked the resources to challenge armed guards. But as they made their way back down the mountain trail, Lillian found herself thinking about the scene in the town square. Thornfield's performance had been masterful, But it had also revealed something important. He was working very hard to control the narrative, to shape public opinion, before anyone could ask uncomfortable questions. Men who were completely confident in their position didn't need to stage elaborate deceptions. Thornfield's careful orchestration suggested that he was more vulnerable than he appeared, that the right pressure applied at the right moment might crack his facade of respectability. "Ben," she said, as they reached the outskirts of town, "what would happen if people knew that the man they arrested wasn't really Mr. Jed? I guess they'd wonder where the real Mr. Jed was, and why Mr. Thornfield lied about catching him." "Exactly. And if they knew he was being held prisoner at the mining claim," Ben's understanding dawned slowly, "they'd want to know why Mr. Thornfield had him kidnapped instead of just turning him over to the law." The kernel of a plan was forming in Lillian's mind, not the desperate rescue attempt she'd initially envisioned, but something more strategic. Instead of trying to free Jed through stealth and violence, they would expose Thornfield's deception publicly and force the community to confront the truth about what was really happening. It was a dangerous gamble that would put all of them at risk. But as they walked through the streets of Cedar Ridge, past the schoolhouse where children had learned to hope, and the boarding house where orphans dreamed of belonging somewhere, Lillian knew that some risks were worth taking. The final confrontation was coming, and it would be fought not with guns and violence, but with truth and the courage to speak it, regardless of consequences. Thornfield had underestimated the power of people who refused to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths demanded action. The battle for Cedar Ridge's soul was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether redemption was possible. For anyone, former gunfighters seeking peace, orphaned children needing families, or communities struggling to choose between profit and principle. The schoolhouse bell rang for the first time on a crisp morning in late February, its clear tone carrying across Cedar Ridge like a declaration of victory, hard won. Lillian stood in the doorway, watching as children streamed toward the building. Not just the orphans who had always been welcome, but children from established families who had finally accepted that education belonged to everyone. The events of that terrible winter day when truth had finally conquered deception felt both distant and immediate. The confrontation in the town square, when Ben Cartwright had stood before the entire community and exposed Thornfield's lies with the passionate eloquence of youth, defending everything he held dear, had changed more than just the fate of one school. It had forced Cedar Ridge to examine its own conscience and choose what kind of community it wanted to become. Tommy Fletcher was among the first to arrive, his reading primer clutched proudly in hands that no longer shook with uncertainty. At 7 years old, he could now read simple stories aloud and was working his way through arithmetic problems with the patient determination he'd learned from watching Jed work. Mrs. Henderson had formally adopted him the previous month, giving him the family stability he'd never known while allowing him to continue his education. Mary Fletcher followed close behind her younger brother, carrying the slate board she used to help other students with their lessons. At 10, she had discovered a natural gift for teaching that reminded everyone of Lillian's own calling. Dr. Warren had begun training her as his assistant, recognizing abilities that would have been wasted in the territorial system's institutional approach to orphan care. The Morse twins arrived together, as they always did, their shared grief over Annie's death transformed into determination to honor her memory through their own achievements. Sarah had become the school's unofficial librarian, organizing the growing collection of books donated by families who finally understood the value of education. Samuel spent his afternoons apprenticed to the town's blacksmith, learning a trade. While maintaining his studies, Ben Cartwright came last, as had become his habit since accepting the apprenticeship with Fisher, the clockmaker in Denver. He spent most of his time in the territorial capital now, learning the intricate skills of his chosen profession, but he returned to Cedar Ridge each weekend to help with the younger children and maintain his connection to the place that had given him hope. Jed emerged from the interior of the schoolhouse, where he'd been arranging desks and preparing the wood stove for the day's lessons. The physical scars from his ordeal at Thornfield's hands had healed, but the deeper wounds, the knowledge that his past would always cast shadows, remained visible to those who knew how to look for them, ready for another day of corrupting. "Young minds with dangerous ideas like reading and arithmetic?" he asked, with the dry humor that had returned gradually as winter gave way to spring. "Always," Lillian replied, accepting the coffee he offered and savoring both its warmth and the domestic intimacy of the gesture. They had married in a simple ceremony the previous month, with the orphans serving as witnesses and Mrs. Garrett providing a wedding cake that had been more enthusiasm than skill, but perfect in its imperfection. The investigation that followed, Thornfield's exposure had revealed a network of corruption stretching from Colorado Territory to New Mexico, involving land fraud, murder, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened certain business interests. Thornfield himself had died during his arrest, shot while allegedly attempting to escape, though witnesses disagreed about whether he'd actually been armed. With his death, many questions would never be answered definitively. But enough evidence had emerged to exonerate Jed of the charges that had haunted him for years. The territorial authorities had quietly dropped the warrant, acknowledging that the case against him had been built on perjured testimony and manufactured evidence. The schoolhouse itself had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they chose cooperation over suspicion, investment over exploitation. The building fund, established after Thornfield's exposure, had grown large enough to support not only educational supplies, but also a small salary for Lillian, making her position sustainable rather than dependent on charity. More importantly, the orphans had found permanent homes throughout Cedar Ridge. Some, like Tommy, had been formally adopted. Others had been taken in as apprentices or household helpers, with arrangements that emphasized family membership rather than mere employment. All of them continued their education, proving that learning and practical work could complement rather than compete with each other. As the morning lessons began, Lillian found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The widow, who had arrived in Cedar Ridge seeking only a teaching position, had discovered love, purpose, and the complex satisfaction of building something lasting from broken pieces. Jed had found something even more precious, proof that redemption was possible, that a man could change fundamentally and be accepted for who he had become, rather than condemned for who he had been. The schoolhouse stood as testament to his transformation, but more importantly, the children's laughter provided daily evidence that construction could triumph over destruction. The territorial inspector, when he finally arrived in April, had been impressed not only by the children's academic progress, but by their integration into the community. His report recommended Cedar Ridge as a model for frontier education, citing the successful partnership between formal instruction and practical apprenticeships. "Education serves its highest purpose," he wrote, "when it prepares young people not merely for examinations, but for meaningful participation in the communities that will shape their futures." But the true measure of their success wasn't found in official reports or administrative commendations. It was visible in Tommy's confident smile as he helped younger children with their reading, in Mary's gentle patience as she bandaged a classmate's scraped knee, in Ben's obvious pride as he showed off the pocket watch he'd crafted during his apprenticeship. The schoolhouse bell continued to ring each morning, calling children to lessons that went far beyond reading and arithmetic. They were learning that communities could change, that outsiders could become family, that the most important construction projects were built not with timber and nails, but with trust and determination. As evening settled over Cedar Ridge, Lillian and Jed walked home together through streets that had become familiar and welcoming. The town was prospering in ways that Thornfield's grandiose development plans could never have achieved. not through dramatic transformation, but through the steady accumulation of small improvements and growing connections. "Do you ever regret it?" Lillian asked as they paused to look back at the schoolhouse, its windows glowing warmly in the dusk. Building the school? Never. Not the school. Everything that came after. The exposure, the investigation, the choice to stay and fight instead of running. Jed considered the question seriously, as he did all matters involving moral complexity. "I spent 15 years running from one place to another, never building anything that would last longer than my next departure. Running felt like freedom, but it was actually the opposite. It was being enslaved by fear of what people might discover about me." He gestured toward the schoolhouse where their students would return tomorrow, eager for lessons that had become adventures in discovery rather than burdens to be endured. This is what freedom actually looks like, building something beautiful with someone you love, for people who need what you have to offer. The first star appeared in the darkening sky, followed quickly by others as the mountain air grew cold and clear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, lessons to prepare, problems to solve, the endless work of maintaining something precious in a world that often seemed hostile to hope. But tonight, walking through a community that had learned to choose courage over comfort, Lillian felt the deep satisfaction that comes from discovering purpose that transcends individual ambition. The schoolhouse they had built together would serve children for generations to come, but more importantly, the connections they had forged would continue to shape Cedar Ridge long after the original builders were forgotten. Love, it turned out, was indeed the most radical act possible. Love for children society had dismissed. Love for a man whose past could have destroyed everything. Love for a community that had the wisdom to choose redemption over retribution. In the end, that love had built something stronger than any development scheme or business plan, a place where broken things could be made whole, where strangers could become family, where hope could take root and flourish against all odds. The bell would ring again tomorrow, and children would come running toward knowledge and possibility. But tonight, the lesson was complete, and the most important truth had been proven once more. Sometimes the most beautiful things are indeed built from the pieces of what came before.